Bjørn, Fano, good to have you back again. I've got the privilege today, or tonight, wherever you may be, middle of the night, middle of the morning, to interview someone I highly regard. And I've been hoping to get him on the podcast for a while now, but recently we worked it out where we had enough time together to catch up. And so um, we're going to be talking with Bjørn Ihler. Bjørn Ihler is the co-founder and CEO of Glitterpill LLC and the co-founder and director of the Khalifa Ihler Institute. Ihler is an internationally renowned expert on counterterrorism and preventing radicalization and violent extremism. Ihler's work is focused on the international dynamics of terrorist networks online and offline. This work has been vital in developing a shared understanding of the global threat landscape and forming national and international policy and practice, regulating technology, online content, and harms while maintaining a principled approach to human rights. Ihler is a member of the Obama Foundation Leaders Europe Network and has, among others, advised world leaders, governments, and international organizations through his work with the Kofi Annan Foundation and the Khalifa Ihler Institute. His work has been instrumental in developing a more comprehensive approach to terrorism and violent extremism across sectors. From 2020 to July 2022, Ihler served as the inaugural chair of the Independent Advisory Committee of the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, facilitating joint efforts across the tech industry to counter the spread of terrorism online. Bjørn is also a survivor of the 2011 22nd July Norway domestic terrorist attacks by far-right terrorist Anders Breivik against the government, the civilian population, and a workers' youth league summer camp, in which sadly 77 people were killed and many wounded. Bjørn has a lived experience in violent extremism, and he has been able to draw from this over many years in his current work. I would like to mahita him or acknowledge him. I would also like to tautoko or support the work that he currently does and just say that what an absolute privilege and honor it is to have him share a few words, insights, reflections, and thoughts. And so from that context, at this time, I would like to introduce Bjørn Ihler. Kia ora whanau, it is really good to have here with us today my good friend Bjørn. Just a big mihi to you. And I just want to say, certainly with your profile and how busy you are, and I really appreciate you taking some time for this little Māori boy down at the bottom of the Southern Hemisphere. So kia ora, Bjørn. Thank you for being
No,
here.
thanks for having me.
Oh, brilliant, brilliant. Well, look, as everyone knows, I've sort of given a pretty impressive introduction about Bjørn, but I don't think it really sort of does him justice in terms of what he does. I've gotten to know Bjørn sort of over the last sort of year or so, and I've been very, very blessed to associate with him, to be at different meetings, in different parts of the world, and watch him in action, and also witness all the incredible work that he does. And most recently, we had the best fish and chips in Copenhagen a couple of months ago. And I think what was really cool about it is, as we were talking about it, is that this fish and chips had sort of like lobster tails as part of the actual sort of menu. So just impressive, man. And in terms of New Zealand, Aotearoa, we think we've got good fish and chips, but just want to holler out to the fish and chip place we were up in Copenhagen. Well done, well done. But,
Yeah, I actually went back there after our meeting there as well. So it's become a regular spot at this point.
No way, no way.
Yeah.
Well, I sort of feel like I missed out, but we're catching up in a couple of months, and so I think we should try it again. So, but look, Bjørn, thank you once again. I think what we might do to begin with is that we might talk about I guess as I said in the profile, Bjørn is a survivor of the July 22nd terrorist attack in Norway in 2011, and by a terrorist. And And since that particular point in Bjørn's life, he's done some amazing things. And I just wanted to mihi out to you, Bjørn, and also to the victims, the families, and just a big heartfelt aroha from here in Aotearoa, and just to sort of have some knowledge of that, and to have spent some time with you. You know, you bear that with such dignity and power, and so just massive love to you, brother. Massive love. So I think what we might do is start there. Actually, is talk about that day, that event, and I guess how it's perhaps shaped what you're currently doing.
Yeah, it's, I don't know, more than the kids later was still a hard day to talk about, you know. But what happened was essentially that I was back in Norway on summer vacation. I was 20. I'd just been spending my first year abroad, studying theatre production of all things over in Liverpool. And so came back on summer vacation and decided to go to the summer camp. It was not my first time at the summer camp. I'd been a member of the Labour Youth Party for a number of years at that point. And so I was having like the summer job and started seeing on Facebook and whatnot that like all my friends were out having fun. And so I decided to join them, right? And that was kind of the vibe of the place. Like people think of it as like largely a political gathering in some ways, and that's been kind of used for like justifying it as a target. But reality was like it was a bunch of kids like just enjoying summer in the countryside in Norway. And like, yeah, it was associated with the party, but also a lot of people were there just to play football with their friends, right? And so, yeah, I went out there on Thursday, the 21st of July, met up with my friends, hung out all night, didn't sleep much, woke up pretty late the day after. And I went to a couple of meetings and workshops and learning about the political landscape of this world. And then we caught the news of there having been a big blast in Oslo. And no one really initially thought that it was a bomb. Although we started getting pictures, iPhones were a pretty new thing at the time, but some of us had them. And we started looking up kind of the news, and so that this explosion in Oslo was pretty massive. But still, like, it was the middle of summer vacation, and Oslo wasn't really like seen as a terrorism target at the time. So it's pretty weird in so many ways. And this was from Oslo. Like I was born and raised in Oslo. We obviously had family in town, and so our little delegation started coordinating and working to figure out like whether our friends from both the government, which was targeted, and the wider area surrounding the government headquarters as well, wider Oslo, were okay, etc. And so that's kind of how we spent the next few hours after learning about that attack. And then while we were doing that, we kind of started hearing weird popping sounds, that's what I would call it. And we were like wondering what was going on, because in our minds, like, the last thing we were expecting was someone kind of shooting children at the summer camp. So we're like, someone might be having a celebration on the other side of the lake. Like, we were on this island in the middle of the lake, right? And having some fireworks or something. But then I saw this guy in dark clothes, walking over a little hill, and people running towards him. Learned later that he was wearing a police uniform, so like maybe people were running towards him to like get information, right? And he lifted his gun and shot those people straight down. And not fully comprehending what was going on, me and my friends kind of turned around and ran into the woods that was surrounding this little camp area that we were in. And for the next hour plus, I was kind of running around in the woods and hiding. I picked up a child who was there with his father, who was volunteering as a security guard. The kid was 8 years old at the time, and we were hiding together for a large chunk of it. And while we were hiding, we heard the gunshots come closer to where we were. A bunch of people came running through the woods where we were hiding, and we joined them in the realization that we couldn't stay where we were, and ran along this track that goes around the island. And like one of the things that still really sticks with me today was as we were running around that, we ran into a place where Breivik had executed several people. And like in this, can really only describe it as this pile of bodies. Somewhere was a cell phone ringing, and it really kind of struck me how connected we were to the rest of the world. That like someone was trying to call someone who would never be able to pick up again, and that's like something I still carry to this day. But after that, I kind of blacked out, and we ended up somehow on the tip of the island, from which we could see a helicopter in the air. There were boats on the water. It was the longest line of ambulances and police cars you could ever imagine over on the other side of the lake. And people were swimming out in the water, etc. And because we saw the helicopter, we thought that like the police was there and we were safe. Turns out later that police helicopter was actually the national broadcaster of Norway and not the police at all. But we tried to get the attention of the helicopter, and while we were there, this man in a police uniform came out from the bushes behind us and said that they'd caught the bad guy. But as he was saying that, he lifted his gun and started shooting at the crowd that I was in. So I took the kid and another kid that we'd picked up at that point and jumped in the water with them. And we managed to kind of get away by crawling in under some bushes that were hanging over the lake and hiding after, well, Breivik trying to kill us. So after that, he went back up onto the island and was actually captured by the police. And like more than an hour after shooting had started, we finally kind of were theoretically safe, but it took years before I kind of ever felt safe again. And so obviously quite I think upsetting event would be like the understatement of the century, but quite traumatic in many ways. And one big driving factor for everything I've done since has really been not just about the pain of losing 69 friends, which we did that day, including friends with strong connections to New Zealand, by the way. Like this was something that was happening in the countryside in Norway, and it had ripples throughout the world. But also, like no one should go through that kind of trauma and the pain and suffering that comes not just from the loss of lives, but also from the loss of the sense of safety, the sense of being safe, being who you are in your home, in your country, in the world. It's really something that no one should go through. And so that became a kind of strong force for what I've been doing ever since.
Oh, yeah, every time I hear you say this, and we've talked about it a few times now, I struggle a little bit just to sort of, I can't understand what you or anyone went through, but I can feel the pain and the sorrow and the loss, and so just yeah, just a big sort of hug at you, bro. Appreciate you sort of like being able to talk about it, I guess, again, and I remember when we talked about sort of doing this sort of this catch up through podcast, that we wanted to acknowledge it as being a really key part, but not something that obviously defines you.
Yeah.
And so I think, what's amazing is that but let's talk about sort of where you've gone from there, because your profile is quite prominent, and I'm going to obviously at some point ask you for some advice about how do we help Indigenous peoples and people like Māori and those people which are sort of have gone through colonization to sort of like engage and work in Western paradigms, and I think you do that every day. So look, first up, you've got a couple of organizations that I'm aware of. There's the Khalifa Institute, and there's also Glitterpill, and I think there's other organizations that you're part of or formed and founded. So should we have a chat about those and tell me, what have you done, man? I mean, you're always doing something.
The short summary, I don't know. Keep doing too many things, I feel like sometimes, but yeah, the Khalifa Ihler Institute is kind of the brainchild of me and my partner in life and in crime and in founding that. Asma Khalifa is just an amazing woman. We started that in 2016, and part of that was we had just moved out of Turkey after we studied together in Istanbul, and after the failed military coup attempt in 2016, academia was kind of shut down, and so we ended up having to move away from Turkey. And at that point, we'd fallen in love, we'd lived together for a year, and we'd decided to move to Sweden. And so as we moved to Sweden, we decided to start this organization to try to find some shape to our work together as well as our lives together. And we started this peace building organization called the Khalifa Ihler Institute, which is in essence working for kind of diverse and thriving communities around the world. We're working a lot on Indigenous peoples issues, Asma being Indigenous North African, and having as a foundational thesis of the organization that violent extremism is the violent denial of diversity, which is something like a definition of violent extremism I came up with while I was living in Turkey, and I was chairing a working group at the UN on youth, peace and security and counter extremism, and I realized that the UN has like 300 different definitions of violent extremism and no one agrees on anything. So why not make another one? But also, like, at that time, I'd been working with former extremists and people who had been involved in violent extremism, both on the perpetrator side and on the side of trying to counter it for a couple of years already, and realized that the one thing that members of ISIS had in common with members of the Hammerskins Nation was that neither one of them wanted to live in a pluralist society. No, neither one of them wanted to live in a society in which people were allowed to essentially be who they are. They wanted to enforce conformity, whether that was in a specific belief system, as in with Islamist extremism, or whether it was in a specific racial way, as in with white supremacism. And so this seems to be a trend that goes throughout all extremist movements, right? Like from Buddhist supremacists to Hindutva to you name it, right? There is this sense of like purity. And so the idea was basically to flip that and say, hey, the issue here is actually like we need to create societies in which diversity can exist and where people can thrive on the basis of that as a foundation for building peaceful and inclusive communities. And so that's kind of turning peace building from the model of like, we have states that are negotiating with each other, to also a model where we work with like really grassroots communities on how to build the infrastructure for having healthier lives as communities internally. And so that's been a lot of the work with the Institute, and a lot of that comes down to like, things like acknowledging and understanding cultural heritage and how cultural heritage informs the ways in which our societies deals with conflict, etc. So really interesting work in and of itself, but because of my kind of personal profile being so tied to the issue of violent extremism, I got more and more dragged into that world. And so while we were kind of in the early stages of the Institute, I continued working a lot on violent extremism. I was always kind of trying to remind people that other forms of violent extremism exists than Islamist extremism. It was a time when the experts of this world seemed very obsessed with ISIS in particular. And meanwhile, we had kind of President Trump growing to prominence in the US, and with that, a whole bunch of white supremacists finding a sense of legitimacy. And social media was also a thing that grew drastically in those years, and in political influence and in influence when it came to how extremists were organizing. And so in 2017, a bunch of tech companies came together and formed what's called the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism as kind of a consortium between them. And then in 2019, that became an independent nonprofit. And I was selected to chair the inaugural advisory committee to that organization. And so got sucked into working a lot on the tech side of extremism and internet governance issues, and how to maintain freedom of expression and basic human rights, another foundational element of the Khalifa Ihler Institute, while also combating the abuse of these digital services by extremist organizations who are using them for coordination and for spreading recruitment materials and for spread propaganda. And so with the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, we worked a lot on the human rights implications of all of these tech companies being able to work together in order to remove content that was in some ways political, but also drivers of violence, and figuring out where those lines are drawn, etc. And then in 2022, I stepped down from chairing that and decided to start Glitterpill along with my colleague Samantha Kuttner. And at that point, we'd been working on things like reports for the January 6th Select Committee on white supremacy, and in particular on the Proud Boys in the US. And we've been doing some work on the footprint these organizations had on social media as well. And so we started Radicalisation as kind of consulting firm using open source intelligence methods to discern how bad actors were abusing services and what service providers could use to protect themselves against that. And so now, a bit more than a year later, we've been running Glitterpill as like a reasonably good company. And Glitterpill also works in tandem with the Khaliq Institute on things like the Global Hate Map, which is kind of a product, if you want to call it that the Khaliq Institute started putting out in 2017, trying to map far right, in particular incidents around the world, to show that this is a global phenomenon, and to show that the far right doesn't work in isolation. We tend to think of it in the context of our national bubbles when we're trying to push back against extremism, right? And we tend to think of it in a very localized context, but that's not how extremist organizations are working. They work as large, like, multinational networks, and they draw on inspiration from each other from all over the place. And so that's really what we wanted to demonstrate there. But that is a product in which we are kind of using the Khaliq Institutes as the nonprofit arm that holds and owns that project, and then Glitterpill provides some of the intelligence and analysis into that in tandem with kind of other elements of our extended network. The Khaliq Institute also runs something called Anti-Fascist Europe, which coordinates at this point about 20 researchers from around Europe who are working in their specific languages to look at what far-right extremism looks like within their context and how that is connected across borders within Europe, and kind of looking at the transnational element there. And so at this point, it's kind of a multi-headed beast of some sort, but that's also a needed approach in some ways when it comes to some of these challenges, because it is a really complex issue, and it is not an isolated issue. Like, hate is hate, and hate affects everyone in this world. And ultimately, like, that's the goal of things like the hate map, is to understand truly the global footprint of it and how to counter it. And in order to do that, we need to be able to work in things like 20 different languages across Europe, right? And not just be focused on, like, what is the Anglophone sphere of folks doing on Twitter these days, which seems to be kind of where the public attention and public focus really quickly goes, right? And that's also one thing we encountered working in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where this summer we did an extensive mapping supported by Internet NZ of kind of the hate landscape in New Zealand, and we recently published our report on that right before the elections, which is available on hatemap.io, which is the new home for our hate map, and where we hope to bring together kind of the threads from the collective or the consortium that is supportive of mapping hate around this world. But we saw a fair bunch of really interesting things in New Zealand that also is similar to things we're seeing in other parts of the world, in particular when it comes to Indigenous peoples issues. Our researcher for New Zealand is Maori, and we saw a fair bunch of tensions there between the Maori population and other segments of the population, predominantly white English heritage, but also other segments of the population. So that founded or kind of worked as foundation for work we're now doing in places like Canada, which has a similar colonial history, but also work we're doing here in the Nordics, where we're also increasingly looking at the relationship between, in particular, the Sami population and like the Norwegian population, and we're seeing what we can learn there in terms of not only seeing the issues and the tensions, but also seeing what potential solutions there might be to some of the problems that we've been experiencing, right? But in particular, how knowledge transfers within various groups, and how trust works, in particular when it comes to trust in authorities, where obviously indigenous peoples have a very painful history of relating to authorities in many parts of the world, and many parts of the world that history is not really history, it's still kind of ongoing. In other parts, it's kind of very recent trauma that exists there, and so learning about that in order to inform things like how we do public health information, for instance, in a way that is received within communities is really important. And in order to understand that, we have to also understand the ways in which these populations are still living under threats, are still living with both trauma from past incidents, but also how kind of continuous both hateful discourse as well as hate crimes plays into the relationship between a white majority population and indigenous population. So that's the surface of what we're doing.
Wow. I want to mihi to our Māori researcher that's doing this work with you, Bjørn, and it actually sort of segues into something that we've talked about, is that, for too long, in terms of, say, intelligence gathering or analyzing data, or, addressing these types of sort of issues around, racism, hate, discrimination, bigotry, whatever it may be, is that quite often it's the indigenous perspective or voice, or just the placement of that particular person in that process that has been absent. And so it's of real interest to me, and as we've caught up with our Māori researchers, that their perspective brings a worldview that has to be confronted, because they come with a worldview that's been lived and embedded. And I think that's a key thing that we talked about, and something that we're potentially looking at doing some work with together, is that looking to ensure that Indigenous voice is heard and not sort of pushed aside. Now, as you know, over the last sort of year or so, we've done a bunch of work in my organisation to work with young people, mainly Māori Pacifica, to help them work through misinformation, disinformation, with the aim of developing sort of prevention programs before radicalisation. And what we found out from all the surveys and the report I shared with you a couple of months back, was quite sort of concerning, but at the same time not a surprise. And that is, Māori don't trust our authorities. We don't trust the government. And so if the government is the primary conveyor of important information, such as vaccinations or mandating or isolation, whatever it may be, is that the first issue that we've got to deal with is one of colonialism, and how it impacts the voice, the people which have been impacted by this phenomena. So the issue becomes for us is that we'll get this messaging, but we're going to look at it dubiously, because we just don't have that trust relationship. And I think that's the question I wanted to ask you right now, is that how does a political respond to that? How do we ensure that the work that you're doing with the Indigenous nations, whether it's in the First Nations up in Canada or the US, or within Aotearoa or the Pacific or the Kuri or the Aboriginals in South Australia, how do we ensure that Gulapil does not sort of also bring a type of well, you're important, but we're going to observe you without having you participate in it? So that's my very hard question for you tonight. Or today it's
Yeah,
morning.
and I think like that's definitely something I'm conscious of as well, right? Like, hey, I'm a white European guy living in Europe, right? And it's always something to be aware of there, and that relationship as well, like making sure that's not exploitative to begin with, but also that it's not tokenistic. Um, and like as I mentioned briefly there, like I used to work in like the peace, like youth peace and security element of like the UN world for quite some time. Um, and this is one thing we saw there as well, where like everyone was talking about the seat at the table, and there was a lot of like pushing for this seat on the table proverbial situation, right? And what kept happening was, first of all, the people who would be seated on the table were like young people, but like usually in their late 20s, early 30s, like my age now. But also they were like the people who put on their suits and spoke like little diplomats, right? And so the representation of youth in those seats and at the tables continued to be non-existent because those people were playing kind of the career game more so than they were generally representing youth voices. And so there's been kind of a shifting element there in terms of how do we think about representation as well, and how do we create structures within representation isn't pure tokenism or pure like surface level, like we'll have like someone from this segment be there and then either have them conform to the expectations of the hegemonic powers, or we'll have them not be listened to genuinely. And so in flipping that, it's really important to always be genuinely working with communities and have representatives of communities really leading the work and leading the focus of that work when it comes to like where should our attention be drawn. And so when it came to working on Aotearoa, New Zealand, one thing that really drove us was that we had an amazing researcher within our team already who happened to also be Maori, right? And like she's been working with us for years in different ways throughout like we call it the Khalifa Ihler Institute Glacier Pill Cinematic Universe at this point, after the Marvel universe. But like she's been a part of like that and various communities for years, right? And so we got this opportunity to work in New Zealand, and we were like, yeah, but we want to do it in our way, and we want that work to be led by the true expert we have on that. And so that work was led by a really excellent researcher who also happened to be Maori, right? And that's been kind of the ethos throughout things, in terms of trying to ensure that all of the work has a local rooting, has a rooting in the communities that are affected by hate in different ways. And so in that, trying to build out not just the tokenistic like corporate idea of what diversity and inclusion looks like, but also actually doing the legwork for that. Like one thing I keep recalling is we did a project through the Khalifa Ihler Institute a few years ago at this point. Actually, it was during like the early days of COVID in Tunisia with the UN, and we realized that UN agency we were working with had mostly been speaking in French, which, to be fair, a bunch of people in like Tunis, the capital city of Tunisia, speaks, but those are reasonably upper classy, well-educated people from the capital, and so there was a lack of representation there with people who speak Arabic, which is the largest language in Tunisia, right? But also there was a lack of representation of people who speak other languages, such as Amazigh, which is the indigenous language of North Africa. And so we decided to kind of go out there on a limb and do surveys in those languages as well. And we got quite different results than what you got by just asking the French-speaking population questionnaires, right? And so approaching diverse communities with the understanding that these are diverse communities and that there are issues that are structural, that comes both to things like language, but also things like how people relate to information gathering is really important, right? Like working, like if I was to come as like a white Norwegian dude and ask a bunch of questions to like a community of young people who are Maori in New Zealand, that would probably yield very, very different results than you asking those questions, just because of our connections to those communities, right? And so I think it's also like always important to acknowledge and be cognizant of what that means and how we can use that to understand not just the data itself, but also like the social dynamics at play when we're working with various communities, right? And that goes back to some of the things you were saying about the surveys and work you guys have been doing in New Zealand on, in particular, information from the government, where there isn't a relationship of trust necessarily, and where there's very good historic reasons for the Maori people not to trust the government. Like that makes sense if you look at the history, right? And the government looks like white European people, and so I as white European people, although not representative of a government, would come with a different kind of baggage into a conversation like that than you would do, or a Maori researcher would do, etc. And so we're always kind of having these candid conversations about power dynamics and all of those things as we are evolving that research, and I think that's really, really important as well.
Well, I've got to say this, to the listening audience, is that meeting Bjørn sort of face to face, o kanahi ki te kanahi, which is our Māori way, and getting to know you and being around you, you have a very, very beautiful mode, all life presence, and you've got what we call mana. So mana is sort of prestige, it's honor, it's you carry it, nobly, and part of that obviously comes from trauma, as we've talked about, but a lot of it comes from the work that you're doing, which is just a pure thing. And so what you just talked about right now in terms of connections, engagement, something that we've been advocating for a while, whether it's with intelligence agencies or governments, is that they tend to sort of focus on enforcement or policies which are structured and which don't particularly work well with communities that just need a bit of trust, a bit of sort of engagement, transparency, openness. I remember talking to one of our Māori chiefs recently on one of the podcasts, Mihi Aotearoa modelling. We talked about potentially, what if our intelligence agencies or governments brought, openly their concerns to the communities and said, look, we need your help, and first and foremost, as opposed to sort of like commencing a strategy of surveillance and that sort of thing, and then coming to us after. And so there's that whole concept of, I really like what you said about when you're thinking about the hate map, you're looking at community engagement, you're looking at their voices, and that's why our Māori researcher, who we will not name, is an amazing person, because that researcher brings that world perspective. But at the same time, it's a big mihi to you, Bjørn, because you bring a sense of safety, and that's what I wanted to say to everyone online, is that who sees this podcast, is that quite often Indigenous peoples need to feel safe in the first place to build that relationship, because we've had so many situations where we've caused to mistrust authority. And I think what you do is you bring that sort of, that beautiful sort of, look, we can trust you, and you're part of our journey, if that makes sense. So thinking about the hate map now, and where you're wanting to take it, and I wanted to just ask a couple of questions around that, technical questions, is that the hate map itself monitors or looks for what, Bjørn? Does it look for, and is it one ideology or ideologies? So what does it specifically do?
Right. So it's very simple and very complicated at the same time, as so many things are in this world. So the hate map, as I mentioned, we started in the Radicalisation Institute, and we did a bunch of monitoring for it. The working definition of violent extremism within our little cinematic universe is the violent denial of diversity, meaning that all extremist groups wants to eradicate diversity and enforce conformity of some form or another within their communities, right? And so that's a quite broad kind of definition. We started off with Western far-right extremism, if you like, looking a lot at, in particular, white supremacy, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and anti-Indigenous that exists in Western European and Anglophone countries, because of the language skills, basically, of the people who were involved, and then our resources pretty much had to go into a bunch of fairly specific scenarios due to the way in which we related to funders. And so we ended up working a lot, in particular in North America, on specific groups surrounding the Proud Boys and how they were tied into things like the January 6th storming of the Capitol. And so our data at this point is fairly skewed, I would say, in the direction of looking at far-right extremism in the West. However, we're now kind of in this phase of making the hate map more standalone, making it now lives on hatemap.io, its own domain, rather than as kind of a subpage of the Ihler Institute's webpage, etc. And part of that strategy is to build towards kind of more of a coalition approach to building out the data set, working with other partners with other resources, other skills and knowledge than what we have within our little universe, in order to also be better at documenting hate of different sorts, right? Because hate is universal and something that exists within pretty much every community, and in order to combat the hate, you have to acknowledge it as well. And in terms of the incidents that goes onto the map, we're looking at kind of the range of attack as well, if you like, where we're taking from my days in peace and conflict studies, we're taking definitional approach to violence that's fairly expansive as well. So we're not looking just at the surface level of hate crimes or terrorist attacks. There's great databases out there on terrorism in particular, like the Global Terrorism Index and the Global Terrorism Database, etc., are really great. But we're looking at the wider range of incidents that may play into a hostile environment, right? And that includes what's called structural violence in the frameworks, which is things like legislation that is discriminating. We're seeing kind of a resurgence to some extent. Well, it's always been there, right? So resurgence is probably not the best word, but we're seeing an increase of use of things like artificial intelligence in court, which is a form of structural violence because those court decisions are based on historic court data that was incredibly biased. If you look to the US in particular, where like the courts has been used as a tool for repression of Black Americans, right? And so looking at things like that goes into like the broader understanding of the hate that is mappable. And then we're also looking at what's called cultural violence, which is like the hatred that lives within our cultures. And so everything from neo-Nazi stickers on the streets and flyers and protests, etc., that creates an environment of hostility, goes into that as well. So we're kind of, our ethos has been like, we should map everything from neo-Nazi stickers to terrorist attacks, and we want to do that globally to understand how environments of hostility leads to terrorism, basically. And so that's part of what we're doing. There's a couple of other elements that have been kind of informative to why we've taken this approach as well. And as I mentioned, understanding the transnational dimension of violent extremism, seeing how various groups internationally are informing each other and collaborating and sharing strategy, sharing ideology, but also like operationalizing that in really harmful ways. Part of the driver of that has been that like even the way in which we've used counterterrorism legislation has been kind of conducive to hatred, right? Islamophobia has been a massive driving factor in counterterrorism policing and counterterrorism legislation in the West for a few decades, at least at this point, probably forever, right? In some way or another. And so part of that is also looking at how we break down this idea that domestic terrorism doesn't exist, which is really something that like is prevalent within legal frameworks, but also showing that what we tend to call domestic terrorism is actually a manifestation of larger international networks, which might be a way of changing the way in which terrorism is prosecuted when it comes from white guys, basically. Like, and so there's all of these different elements to how different stakeholder communities may use this information, right? Like hoping the courts and the judicial sector will use our mappings to understand that there is no such thing really as, or either all terrorism is domestic in some way, or all terrorism is international in some way, because of these relationships that form the backbone of why these attacks happen, but also really hoping it is useful to various communities and understanding how they relate to each other and how there are issues that create massive tensions and issues of trust and issues of feeling safe in your own home and in your own skin, really, around the world, right? So yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there in terms of like
Wow,
what
wow.
we're
So
approaching.
so that sort of like leads me into sort of, my final one or two last questions, and it's really interesting because we talked about how governments will basically develop their own sort of indicators of hate and extremism, and they'll capture that information. They'll use it internally within their services or the organisations in the intelligence community or the IC. We've got tech companies which are doing the same thing. So we're
Yeah,
finding more and more. I mean, big mihi out to GIFCT and to the advisory group, and I went to one of those meetings and observer, as we did back in San Fran a few months
yeah.
ago. I saw them in action, and it was really good to see everyone at the table. But so you've got them now, but what we are sort of talking about here is something which is in the middle, which is the civil perspective of civil society. Someone like, as an example, Clitterpill, and and while you're right, there are civil organisations that do look at terrorism, that they do report in terms of trends and that sort of thing. There's probably, in your mind, is probably not actually anyone out there per se that's doing this type of thing potentially, or trying to do it globally. Talking on your definition, so my question to you is that who would use the product, who's using the service, and you've touched on it because I'll disclose to everyone right now is that I at some point we're going to be working together, and I'll be sharing what we pick up and our information directly with Bjørn and his team, and there'll be a collaboration, in terms of helping to support the kaupapa or the mahi or the importance of hate map, and it'll be clearly just from a Māori Indigenous perspective, potentially a Pacifica, but it'll be a worldview to help support your Māori researchers. So we're going to be very biased and selfish about that. But my question becomes this: is that who uses this product? Bjørn, who's it designed to impact the most? I mean, who's going to be
It's
that person that says, every morning I'm going to get up and I'm going to check out, hate map and see what's going on?
it's really designed for communities to be able to understand where they are situated in a broader threat landscape to some extent. And so big focus is really like figuring out how does like the Maori community use this information in order to understand not just what threats they're facing, but also how to use that for empowerment, how to use that to break down those barriers and combat it. Like the goal of the hate map is for there to be no hate to map. Right. And we want to figure out like how to translate that. So like, how do we use this information now to acknowledge and understand that there are these issues, and that we as grassroots communities from around the world need to work together to combat those issues. I think like one very clear thing, or one thing that's become very clear in our work with like government or work with the tech sector as well, has been like they are there to serve themselves. Like the government intelligence services are there to protect the government. They aren't necessarily there to protect, well, in a functioning democracy, they should be there to protect the people, but most countries are not functional democracies. And to some extent, like intelligence services do protect people, but do they protect all the people, etc. Right? Like those are, or do they like paint entire groups of the population as threats to the national security they are trying to protect? Like these are like big discussions within the national security world as well, where where we come from is we want people to be able to protect themselves, and we want people to understand what threats they're facing, but also we want to break down those threats in a way where we take a really humane kind of approach to building relationships that foundationally change the fabric of society in ways that are more conducive to healthier relationships. Like, this is where like the healthy and thriving communities element of the mission statement of the Khalifa Ihler Institute comes in, where like if you build a healthy and thriving community, people will not hate each other, people will not go down paths of radicalization, and people will not become terrorists, right? Like that's the foundation of it. We want to be as early stage in the prevention of that as possible. And in order to understand how we can do that, we need to understand how it manifests in these really problematic ways at this point.
I've got to say this is that I'm so impressed, because we talk about data sovereignty for Indigenous groups of people. We talk about how we've been studied, we've been observed, and data and information has been removed from us. And just a big sort of holler out to Ngā Pera Riley that works in this space, kia ora iwa. But one of the things that stands out is that Indigenous communities for such a long time have been almost in that glass bottle. We've been studied, but those studies are not part of our we're not participating. It's not being applied or used for us, and so it really resonates in terms of what you're saying, is that it's for the community, whether it's Indigenous or other communities, our trans family and so on, our anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, all the different groups which are out there which are subject to this type of horrible thing in terms of hate. And as long as those communities have some say in it, they're part of the process, or actually not some say, but are very much at the center of it, driving it, then this is quite reassuring, because you're not developing something where you technically extract data and basically study from afar and then present something which is not as authentic as it should be. So just a massive mihi out to Bjørn, because I think the way that you answered that is certainly from a Māori perspective, and I don't speak for all Māori, I never have. I speak for one Māori, which is myself, and so I'm one Indigenous person presenting one Indigenous view. But from my perspective, is that it's encouraging to hear that if we're going to be part of this type of process, that we're going to be involved in it, which means that we can help determine and respond and obtain the things that we need to sort of improve our own lives. So just kia ora to you, Bjørn. That's just a beautiful thing to say. Well done. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I think another element of it that we try to embody within our community as well, it's really not just like the fact that we have experts who are also on the being targeted side of the hatred that are helping out or leading the research in different ways, but also the fact that we are trying to cross-pollinate that in different ways. So like you mentioned anti-Semitism there, like or leading research on anti-Semitic hatred, in particular in North America, is done by Samantha Kautner, who is of Jewish heritage and North American, right? Like, and so she's focused to some extent on that and white supremacy in the US in general. And what's that done to the Jewish community? We also have like an excellent like Muslim researcher from Norway who's been looking at both the Islamist extremist communities in the Nordics, but also at Islamophobia in the Nordics. And it's really important to understand like the Islamist community, not from like the white non-Muslim majority perspective, but also from the perspective of what does it mean to be a Muslim in a Muslim minority country where there is an Islamist extremist segment to the Muslim community, right? And so we get like these layers of complexity, really, in our understanding. Also having, at this particular point in history, if you like, our Muslim researcher from the Nordics and or Jewish researcher from the US working together on observing the incredible spike in both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism we're seeing around the world in reaction to what's going on in Israel and Gaza over the last like month and a half has been really eye-opening in many ways, I think. And we see kind of this issue that like there are special interest groups, right? Like there's this group that works on anti-Semitism specifically. There's this group that works on Islamophobia specifically, and they don't talk to each other. And so by bringing that into one central place, but also one place that is largely led by those affected, is really helpful in creating a space for collaboration and for understanding that these are not separate issues. Like the issue of Islamophobia and the issue of anti-Semitism, it really comes from very similar places in many ways, and they are driving each other in different ways. But also like the Nazis who are now supporting Islamist extremist groups because they are supportive of anti-Semitism are like deeply problematic, right? And likewise the other way around, like the supremacist groups who are now incredibly Islamophobic because they are supportive of Israel as part of, like, we've seen like that be part of a Christian evangelism that is trying to push forward the end of times in different ways, etc., like in really weird ways, and like those have been like playing into this. And so like just being able to some extent understand the totality of the hatred that is happening rather than just focusing on like this specific special interest group is really helpful in applying kind of a broader analysis to what's happening.
And I think you're right. I mean, hate map, maybe it's called the peace development map in the future, I don't know, but I was just going to say this to you, Bjørn. You know, I think the work that you're in is it's not easy. This is, you know, you're not getting up in the morning and delivering milk, and I'm not saying that that's not a tough job. I many years ago as a young man, I delivered milk, you know, and it was quite hard. But you know, you're doing something every day that is very confronting, and I guess that's my very last question: is that, you know, for those that that are in this particular field, you know, certainly, or those that are around it, or the families that are working with people like yourself, or you know, people which are dealing with this type of sort of you know, part of humanity, is that, you know, and that this is my final question: is how do you keep yourself resilient? How do you keep yourself real? And you know, what tips can you give? I know that when I do this, Mahi, and I'm part of a couple of organisations which, you know, digs a little bit deep into some really bad stuff, is that it takes me a bit of time to sort of, you know, get through it and wash through it. And I've got a bunch of things that I do, but what do you do, my friend? How do you stay resilient? How do you stay at peace? I guess that's a hard question. Maybe it's not. Go ahead.
Oh, it's definitely a hard question. It's something I've struggled a lot with over the years. Like part of that has been my own relationship to trauma, dealing with PTSD, etc. as well, right? Which is really hard journey in many ways, and it's also led to really toxic things in many ways, and for a lot of people that's kind of the bane of them. Thankfully for me, it's not been that. I live in the middle of the forest. That's like the simple answer, right? Like, I spend way too much time in airports and traveling around the world and like working with people on these issues, right? And so having the ability to kind of go back home and have a safe home, a home that is somewhat isolated, and a place where I can just be and go walk in beautiful nature with my dog. It is one way in which I stay sane. The other element is having really good people around me. And so within the cinematic universe, we have a really good crew. And having learned from Taika Waititi, we talk it through as a crew when we're faced with challenges, right? And so we all see horrific stuff pretty much every day, and it's really kind of a communal effort to grapple with that, and to stay healthy as we grapple with that as well. Another element to that is that we're right now in the process of building out and relaunching what's been called the Glitterpill community, which predates Glitterpill as a company, something Sam started many years ago as kind of a Facebook group initially of researchers and people who are dealing with extremism in different ways. And so we're kind of building out what that means in terms of peer support, not just within our company or within the cinematic universe, as we're calling it, but also across the wider sector. And I think in the last year or so, there's been an increased element of focus on like health and well-being for researchers in particular. But researchers are not the only people who are dealing with this. Or like researchers with formal associations with universities and institutions are not the only people dealing with this. We're seeing kind of increasing growth of like volunteering freelance activists, researchers who are spending a lot of time looking at really toxic communities online in particular, who are providing incredibly valuable intelligence to both intelligence community and to organizations like ours. And they don't have a support system. And so we really want to build that support system. So that's kind of in something we'll be rolling out in early 2024 as well. So yeah, there's all of these things where like we are trying to stay sane. We're trying to make sure that we do this in as healthy and as a safe way as possible, and also that we are we're giving it forward. We're bringing that on to kind of the next generation of researchers and people who are involved and engaged in this field as well. Like I know for sure that like over the decade plus that I've been in this work at this point, there's many ways in which like dealing with me as a survivor of extremism and as someone who has this drive to be involved could have been done much more healthily from both my own perspective, but also from things like organizers of conferences and events perspective, right? Like that's really an important element that is finally something that we're kind of ready to formalize and ready to push going forward. And so yeah,
Well, brother, it's always good to talk to you. And I just wanted to tell everyone this is early in the morning up in Sweden, and I appreciate you. You know, you making that time for me to catch up, and we're catching up. Remember, in the forest, but not in winter. I said that to you. I think
Yeah,
when I checked the
it's all
dates,
snowy outside today, which is
yeah,
nice. But
well,
yeah,
when I checked the dates, I think it was in February. I realized I checked the temperatures and the conditions. I think I'll wait for a few more months after, but
yeah,
yeah. But really looking forward to catching up with you soon. But I just want to say to you at the same time, just a big mihi to you. You know, much aloha. Really appreciate the work that you're doing. You're someone I hold in the highest esteem, and you know, working in this particular sort of I hate to say industry, which it's become, is a hard thing to do actually in many respects. And so to work alongside people like yourself, which is a real human perspective, but also a perspective of someone that's been impacted, which is what a lot of people don't have. And you know, so we have to keep acknowledging that, keep that mihi out to you, and you know, and also to think about what happened here. You know, March 15th, 2019. You know, our own attack, and you know, so I always say this: a big mihi out to the families, and you know, to those who are impacted or still impacted to this day, as well as yourself and your whānau, and those that are survivors. So, you know, peace and love to you, brother. You know, we'll catch up very, very soon, and I just want to say, just stay as warm as you can, over the next couple of months.
yeah. I'll light the fire behind me here. To try to
All
warm up
right.
a bit. Thank you so much.
Okay. Kia ora, bro.